Right, so hey guys, welcome back to another main video. My name is of course Jake, and in this video we're going to be talking about camera settings on one of these bad boys, a DSLR. A lot of people think, geez, what are all these settings on the back of a camera? There's all these numbers, all these weird buttons like ISO, what's TV, AV, what does all this mean? But people can take all these good pictures, but what do these settings really mean? Well, let's find out. Let's start off by talking about the modes on the top of the camera. So we've got a full automatic mode, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's full automatic, it does everything itself. You can't adjust anything except your shooting mode. Like you can adjust what file you're shooting in, like raw, JPEG, small JPEG, large JPEG, all of that sort of thing. But that's it. You can't do anything else. Everything is full automatic. We head on to the next mode, which is P for program. That's what that means, and you can adjust a few things. Like you can adjust, your shooting mode. You can adjust your metering. We'll get to that a bit later. Your focus modes and stuff. So autofocus, manual focus. You can adjust your file format. So as I just said, raw JPEG. You can adjust your white balance, your picture style, your ISO, which we'll get to a bit later, and your exposure compensation. And we'll get to all of those a bit later, just going through what you can adjust. Next we head over to TV, which is time value or shutter speed priority, as people like to call it. So what it is a manual mode. There's 3 manual modes. There's TV, AV, and full manual. TV, as I just said, is time value or shutter speed priority. So you can adjust everything except your aperture. And we'll get to all of the settings just in a minute. As I said, just going through all the settings, telling you guys what you can actually adjust. We go into AV, which is aperture value. Or aperture priority. You can adjust everything except the shutter speed. So it's based on if you set your aperture to what you want, the camera automatically will set your shutter speed. And in time value, if you set your shutter speed, the camera will automatically set your aperture. So if you're out shooting and you want a wide open aperture all the time, but you don't always want to be having to change your shutter speed all the time, you can set your aperture to your lowest aperture, say wide open, and the camera will set the shutter speed automatically. It's really handy, especially if you're shooting weddings, stuff like that, and you don't really have to be changing a lot of settings. It just makes things much easier. Next we've got full manual, and you can adjust absolutely everything in this. I use this the majority of the time unless I'm shooting much of the same images in the same settings where they don't really have to be adjusted. I just leave them in aperture value and just set the aperture and shoot. Right, there's all the basic camera settings on each of the modes. Let's really go into how the camera works. Well, if we take this lens off, in here, just in here, we've got a little mirror, so the light goes in there and reflects up and is straight out the back of the camera so you can see. That's how that works, but when you take an image, that mirror flicks up, and if you look in there, behind those curtains is a digital negative, which I like to call it, or the sensor. And that, as you take an image, that curtain opens up, the sensor is shown, light hits that, and it's captured. I'll put this lens back on so we don't hurt anything. That's the basics of how a DSLR works. It's pretty much the same for any DSLR or any camera, even mirrorless cameras. They just don't have a mirror in them. The sensor opens up, light hits it, and that's it. The image gets recorded straight into the memory card. Right, I'll put the camera down now. I want to talk about shutter speed. As I said, when light hits that sensor, it gets recorded to the memory card, but that sensor is only open for a period of time, and shutter speed is that period of time. It could be 1/50th of a second, it can be 8,000ths of a second, it can be 500ths of a second, or it can be 30 seconds. It depends on what light you have, and it adjusts your images in different ways. Like if you're shooting in broad daylight, it's impossible to have a shutter speed like 15 seconds. It's just not going to work because the shutter is open too long, too much light comes in, and the photo is just going to be blown out. Shooting in broad daylight, you might want a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and that can vary from your aperture and your ISO, but we'll get to those settings a little bit later. But yeah, shutter speed is how long your shutter is open to bring in light to affect the images. The longer you have your shutter open for, the more movement there is. So if I'm moving and the shutter is open for roughly 1 second. So if I moved, click, click, that movement will be recorded and it'll be a blurry image. So if you're gonna shoot roughly under 1/10th of a second, you need a tripod, as you're gonna get camera shake, and that's not really good in an image unless you're really looking for it. So like in landscape photography, as I do, the light can be really low and I might need a shutter speed of even 30 seconds. And in that 30 seconds that the shutter is open, clouds can move, water can move, and it really creates that milky effect that a lot of people think is photoshopped, and it's actually not. It's just being creative with camera settings. That's pretty much it. But yeah, that's camera settings. Let's get on to aperture and we'll explain exactly what that is. Right, aperture along with shutter speed affects the light going into your camera. Aperture is based in your lens on your camera, and 3.5, if you have an aperture of 3.5, 2.8, 1.2, 1.8, anything like that, really low number, it means the aperture is going to be bigger. If you go up to f22, f28, f27, any of them, they're going to be really small. And if you really think about it, the bigger the hole, the more light comes in. The smaller the hole, the less light comes in. They have a rule called the sunny 16. So usually people, when they're shooting in broad daylight, they put their aperture at roughly about 16. It's just a nice clean part of the lens that people like to use, and it does change your effects and things like that, and it just makes the image look really vibrant and nice. Along with changing light, it also affects the camera's depth of field. And what that is, have you ever seen them really nice portraits of people and there's a really blurry background? Well, that's the depth of field. They've used an aperture really big, like 2.8 or something like that, and that creates a lot less depth of field, so there's not much to play with. So if I'm focusing on my hand, the background's gonna be all blown out. But if I use an aperture of like f18 and I focus on my hand, the background will be more in focus. It lowers, the higher you have your f-stop, the bigger the depth of field gets. The more focus area that becomes in focus to your camera. The smaller the number, so like 3.5, 5.6 or lower, so 2.8, 1.8, the smaller it gets, the more narrow. So if I've got my hand like that and I focus there, if I'm at 1.8, this part of the hand is going to be all blown out. It's going to be blown out, it's not going to be in focus. If I have an aperture of like f16, if I focus there, that's going to be all in focus still. It's still going to be in focus past that. That's how it works. That's what depth of field is. It can be really fun to play with and experiment and create really cool effects like bokeh, using it with lights, focusing on a subject, having little lights behind it like in city lights, stuff like that. Yeah guys, that's aperture. That's really what that does. Let's get on to ISO and we'll see what that really is. ISO really means it's just the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. Because you're probably thinking, if you're in low light and you want a faster shutter speed, why not just boost your ISO up to 6400, 3200, something like that, and just get a faster shutter speed instead of using a tripod or a flash? Why not do that, Jake? Well, the higher you have your ISO, the more grainy it uses. It's making your sensor work a lot harder. It's pushing a lot more pixels, trying to get it a lot more light in, if that makes sense. Like, the harder you work it, the worse the image quality is going to be. It's going to make it grainy. They call it noise, so it's going to make it really noisy and unattractive and not as sharp, not as clean, crisp, sharp. So you really got to play with it and really have a look, and depends on your camera. Some cameras can really go good with ISO and use a high ISO and be quite clean. Some don't really. My 7D, just for instance, my 7D, once they go past about 1600, I don't really like to go past 1600. It gets a little bit too noisy, 3200, 64. It's a little bit too noisy and I don't really like it. Use flash or something like that to get past them problems, if you know what I mean. But if you got a tripod, all good. Use your tripod, keep your camera still and steady. Use a slower shutter speed, keep your ISO as far down as you can, especially landscape. If you've got a tripod, bring that shutter speed down, bring more light in, use a small aperture or whatever aperture you want. If you want that depth of field, use a higher aperture like f16 or something. But if you have a tripod, as I just said, bring that ISO down to 100 or 200 to get that nice clean result, especially for the quality. If you're printing or something like that, you want that crispy quality. So yeah guys, that's ISO. Next quickly, I'm just going to talk about metering modes. Metering modes don't always have to be used that much. I rarely use them. I only use the evaluative metering mode, which, what that does, metering modes, they adjust the way your camera reads light. So evaluative reads the whole sensor, if that makes sense. And then there's center weight, which reads partially in the middle, and then there's spot metering. Spot metering and evaluative metering are the only two I use. Evaluative, as I said, takes up the whole sensor, so it reads the whole sensor and makes sure everything is exposed nicely, so nothing's too dark, nothing's too light. It makes it equal sort of thing. But spot metering, wherever you're focusing, it will adjust your exposure and compensation for that. So if you're in manual and that little timeline, to try and get that into 0, that's where your camera thinks is the correct exposure. So if you're using spot metering and you're focusing on something dark, it's going to read that and it's going to make you bring your exposure right up because you're focusing on that. It's metering for that. Center weight, it does the whole lot. It's much better, especially if you're shooting landscape. You want everything to be exposed. It's only for portraits in broad daylight that you really have to worry about. But yeah, that's metering. Next, I'm just going to briefly talk about white balance. White balance is how your camera reads color. Yes, I'm going through a few settings here, but they all come into account with how to take an image in manual mode. A camera doesn't read color like we do. Like, we look around and everything looks white, everything looks green, everything looks blue. Like, I look at this shirt and it looks purple. But a camera doesn't always think that way. It doesn't have eyes like we do. You have to set the color for how you want it. So you've got to set it for daylight, you got to set it for shade, you got to set it for flash, you got to set it for tungsten light, halogen lights, you got to set it for fluorescent, you got to set it for however you want. And if you've got custom lights, you can set it for that. You've just got to set it in a custom mode and etc, etc. But that's what you do. You can always set it to auto, so it does it itself. But sometimes it doesn't give you the best result. It can give you a bit of a flat sort of look. If I'm out in daylight, use daylight. If you're in shade, use the shade. If you're cloudy, cloudy. It's pretty simple. Just click the button that says white balance and have a look. It's pretty simple. Just check it out and you'll get what I mean. Right, I just want to talk about focal length and what that can do to your images. It doesn't just zoom or become wide. It doesn't just do those things. If you're taking a nice portrait of someone, okay, a lot of people will say, get nice and close to the subject. Don't get too far away and zoom up. Become nice and close and get in that personal space and take the photo. That's not always the case. It doesn't look flattering. It is not a nice look. Wide angle lenses like to stretch. Zoom lenses like to compress. There's stretched and compression. So if you zoom up on someone and there's nice mountains in the background, the camera, when it zooms, it will bring the background and the subject together. So the mountains will look like they're right behind the subject. They'll be nice and blurred. It'll look nice. But yeah, that's pretty much it. You just have a fiddle around, grab your camera, zoom up, take a photo, and take one wide. that's what it does. It compresses, makes things a little bit different, compresses perspective, and yeah, so it brings it in and brings it closer. So lastly, I just want to say how to put camera settings into video work. If you guys just want to do video work, how do you do that? You got to adjust your shutter speed and all of that in video, but how does that work? I'm not taking photos. It doesn't open and close like when you take photos in video work. Well, what it does, it comes down to the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 30 FPS, the recommended shutter speed for 30 FPS is doubling it. So 60. If you're shooting at 60 FPS, have a shutter speed of 120. You've always got to double it. If you don't double that and you add more shutter speed, so if you're at like 30 FPS and you have a shutter speed of 250, well, it's gonna make the photo, like if there's moving objects, it's gonna make the video look very jerky and not that nice. So stick to the rule, double the shutter speed for what your frame rate is, and that's the way to go. It's much easier. I'm not really that into video work, like I don't know exactly that much about manual video work. I know the basics, but I haven't done it long enough to really teach myself and learn. But with photography, I've done it for many, many years, and I understand how it all works inside out. So yeah guys, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope that was a really big help to you guys and you understand a bit more on how a camera works, the settings on a camera, what they do, and how things get affected. But the easiest way to learn, pick up a camera. Doesn't matter whose it is, pick it up and say, alright, what did he say about that shutter speed again? The lot slower it is, the more blur there is, things like that. There's depth of field in aperture. Just have a play around, have a go, do little tests and stuff and go, that's how it works. That's how I did it. It was the easiest way to learn, along with other videos. That's how I learned. So now I've learned, I want to teach you guys. Hope that helped. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Later guys.